Hello, everyone. Thanks for being with us tonight. We think we have a really engaging and topical panel for you. When Sanaz from Storyline Partners brought this issue up to the LGBTQ plus chairs, we thought it'd be topical and important to discuss. And it really resonated with me personally because my maternal grandmother literally walked across the border from Nuevo Laredo into Laredo, Texas to give birth to my mom. She changed the lives of her future grandkids by doing so. And of course, that was decades ago, and things have gotten worse at the border. And not everyone has an abuelo who is able to overcome fear and border patrol officers to do that. So the border issue is definitely one of intersectionality we're going to find. And it's also one that writers are exploring in their work. So we're going to talk to our writers about that aspect. But first, I'd like to set the stage for what is going on, because there's a lot of noise right now in our news, right? There's local, national, global storms everywhere. And while some stories take up more attention than others, what we know for sure is that the border issues are not going to end anytime soon. And we're going to talk about how they affect the LGBTQ plus community in particular. And to start, I'd like to ask Amy and Ty to kind of set the stage of where we are. Can you share some statistics with us about what's happening at the border, what the stats are for LGBTQ plus community from a bird's eye perspective?
I definitely will love to jump in. My name's Ty Cobb. I use he, him pronouns, and I work the Human Rights Campaign. And at HRC, I run strategic initiatives, but work a lot with our teams that work on both public policy advocacy that relates to refugees, as well as storytelling about the intersection of LGBTQ people and immigrant rights. And it's exciting to be here with all of you because we need your help telling these stories, and we hope you do tell these stories. It's a hard question to answer, and I'm going to start broadly and then pass it over to my colleague in the movement, Amy, to talk about the southern border, but I'm going to start a little bit more broadly about LGBTQ refugees and refugees in general. But the reason it's a difficult question to answer is because if you look at one of the primary groups of refugees, the 26.2 million refugees around the world that are in the UN system, the UN doesn't collect sexual orientation or gender identity data on those refugees. So we really don't have a good sense of how many of those 26.2 million folks are LGBTQ plus. We could estimate that number is likely well over 1 million, looking at current demographic data estimates for LGBTQ populations, but it's a sizable part of the community. Looking a little bit more at the US and looking at those that are resettled in the United States as refugees through a resettlement program, the US currently has a goal of settling 125,000 refugees this year. However, less than 10,000 at this point have been resettled in the United States this year, mainly because under the Trump administration, the refugee resettlement program was fairly decimated, and there's been not enough time and still a lot of energy and resources needing to go into rebuilding that, despite the pretty ambitious numbers of 125,000 refugees being resettled in our country this year. A couple of things to note about the process of being resettled as a refugee in the United States through the resettlement system. One, the way you end up in the refugee resettlement system, and this is I'm doing this in the most simplistic form of describing because it's actually an incredibly complex system, is you would likely flee your country to another country, and in that country apply to be determined to have the status of a refugee through the UN. There, you would actually be sent to a country that accepts refugees and resettled in that country. And the US is one of the handful of countries that take refugees through the refugee resettlement system. But a couple of things to think about is when someone ends up applying to be a refugee with the UN, oftentimes those folks have to live in refugee camps for some period of time or even their whole lives. And to think of what does it look like to be LGBTQ in an environment that is difficult for anyone, nonetheless someone whose sexual orientation or gender identity may make them uniquely different in that environment and the subject of violence and discrimination. Also, once resettled in the United States, often LGBTQ refugees are resettled in communities where there are not a lot of LGBTQ community resources. There's no guarantee you'll be in a big city like a Los Angeles or a New York or Washington, D.C. or a Philly. And so some folks are left trying to figure out how to get resources for them. Also, trans refugees that go through this experience often face dead naming, hostility, misgendering throughout the process. And LGBT refugee may be experiencing what it looks like to be out for the first time when they arrive in this country. And while that's exciting, it's also daunting and it's also overwhelming at times. And so there's a full range of emotions of living your authentic self in a new community in a way that maybe you weren't able to do before. And lastly, one of the things that I thought about as I was thinking about the unique experience of LGBTQ refugees in going through the resettlement process is many of the resettlement organizations in the United States are religiously affiliated. And why that matters here for our community is oftentimes the persecution or the fear that, or the discrimination or the violence you face came under the banner of faith. And so even those who are helping you resettle once you get to the United States are often met with mistrust because you're coming through an organization whose mission in serving refugees is often connected to a denomination of faith. In addition, just in brief, I'll jump into the area I know Amy's going to talk about a little bit more, and that's the world of asylum seekers. And so the folks that are actually crossing a border or coming to a border and claiming asylum. According to the UN, there's 4.5 million asylum seekers around the world. And so it's a large population as well. There are only a few dozen countries that actually will allow someone to apply for asylum based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and the US is one of those. That also means that the US has LGBTQ asylum seekers coming to our borders or applying for asylum from countries around the world. If you look at data from Immigration Equality, an organization that does pro bono legal services for immigrants in the United States, 33% of their clients are coming from the Caribbean. About 30% are coming from South America and Central America, and 20% from Asia, 13% from Africa, and 5% from Europe. Now, while the numbers may vary year to year on these things, what I think it tells us is that we have asylum seekers from across the globe entering the United States to seek safety and protection. Some of those folks are coming for reasons that have nothing to do with their sexual orientation and gender identity, but may experience the process differently because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Some may be fleeing countries that actually criminalize their identity, or they're subject to threats of violence or even threats from their family and community because of who they are. And then there's also folks that come into the United States and file for asylum for other reasons. For example, a student comes to study in the United States, comes out, posts a picture from Pride on their social media, gets threats from back home and knows they can't return, and file for asylum because to return back to their country of origin would be dangerous. And so with that gives you a little bit of a picture of what that experience looks like. I really want to pass things over to Amy, who's going to talk a little bit more specifically about what things look like at our southern border.
Sure. And that's great. Thank you for sharing that. So basically, we've got millions of people trying to, at the border, trying to come to the border. So you're talking, if you're saying 4 million, 10%, if you say 10% of the population is LGBTQ, you're talking 400,000 people, right? It's a draconian and labyrinthine process, and it's often curated by the very organizations that have persecuted people for exactly who they are and the places they're leaving. So it's certainly a fraught and troubling time for those folks who are going through that. And that you really set the stage for that. And Amy, tell us more.
Thanks so much. So just for super brief, my name is Amy Fisher. I'm the America's Advocacy Director at Amnesty International USA. I lead our advocacy work on refugee and migrant rights. And, I can't imagine a better and more challenging time to have this conversation. and particularly this piece about the border right now, it's a place of a lot of things. The border is a place where the human right to seek asylum is violated every day. It's a place of connection and encounter for the communities that have made their homes in the borderlands. And it's a place that has become so incredibly politicized. So, you know, Ty touched on this a little bit, but like, let's back up a second and say that for years and years and years, refugee and asylum issues were bipartisan issues supported by both sides of the aisle. And then sort of as our politics evolved, so did the politics around the border, and border policies started stemming from these politics. So, when we talk about the border, what we're often talking about is people seeking asylum. And despite what you might see on the news, you can't actually seek asylum until your foot is in the country, right? And there is no wrong way to seek asylum. There's not, you know, one way versus another way that is any more or less rights affirming than another way. So leading up to sort of where we're at today, I would say in around 2014, 2015, there was a significant increase, specifically of Central Americans arriving to the US southern border. And it was at that time when we started to really see a crackdown on the right to seek asylum, both aimed at deterring people from seeking asylum and punishing those that did. And then, as Ty mentioned, in the Trump administration, we saw a complete and total gutting of our refugee and asylum systems. And while the Biden administration has worked to undo of those, a lot of those policies are still continuing today and is shaping what we see at the border and what's like very much the like top thing being debated today on the political stage. And so what we have is thousands and thousands of people from literally all over the world. It's not just Central Americans coming to seek asylum at the border. It's people that are fleeing violence and persecution from all over the world that are coming to the southern border to seek asylum. And so many of those people, you know, we don't have the exact numbers, but so many of those people, because of what Ty said about how the U.S. does have protections for people that are fleeing gender-based violence and fleeing political persecution based on, you know, gender and sexual identity. So many of those people are fleeing because of their LGBTQ status. And they have a right to seek asylum, and that right is being violated. So like there's a handful of ways in which that right is being violated on a daily basis. First, most people that are coming into the country are not getting allowed to seek asylum. And so there's a handful of ways in which that is happening. One is the migrant protection protocols, also known as Remain in Mexico, or as my dear friend Gerline calls it, I think what is it, Gerline? The Migrant Persecution Program or something like that is what you like to call it. And what that is, known as MPP, is it forces asylum seekers to go through basically what is a super rapid sham asylum process while they await in exceedingly dangerous conditions in Mexico without any supports or attorneys. And those conditions in Mexico are so particularly dangerous for our LGBTQ siblings.
So, Amy, real quick, sorry. So the U.S. is like, oh, you can stay over there and deal with that while waiting to seek asylum here. So, you know,
camp out in a remarkably dangerous situation,
yeah,
in a tent, and go through this super complicated process while in danger without any legal support.
Yeah, good. Find your own lawyer, find your own sanitation, find your own food, all that stuff.
Yeah. So though that's one group of people. And then we have this other chunk of people that are just basically being summarily expelled under a policy called Title 42. So Title 42 is like, it's a public health policy. It's been around forever, but it's an authority that Stephen Miller and his friends in the Trump administration use to expel people seeking asylum under the guise of public health. And basically what it is there's a pandemic pushing you back. Some people are being pushed back into Mexico. Some people are being expelled to the countries that they fled from without any type of screening as to whether or not there will be harm when they are returned, whether it is to Mexico, whether it's to a third country. So for example, there are many Venezuelans that are being expelled to Colombia under Title 42. It is Title 42 that has really fueled the mass expulsions of Black migrants, particularly to Haiti. There's no screening, just massive expulsions. And this is the thing, just to say that Biden has said that he's terminating this policy in mid-May, but it's the thing that politicians in Congress are currently revolting and holding up COVID funding over, right? And so, like, I live in DC. Yesterday, Remain in Mexico was at the Supreme Court, and today, COVID funding is being held up, and everybody in Congress is talking about Title 42. And these programs or policies or whatever it is that you want to call them sort of just like create this invisible wall that makes people have zero access to asylum, are just thrust into danger and just being completely removed from accessing the system and being thrust back into the very danger that they fled.
Wow.
And then you have this, oh, sorry, Spiro, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I didn't know if you had one more thought on that, but I also wanted to talk about how we discussed earlier this week one-on-one that we're talking mostly about LGBTQ, people of color and immigration, queer, but also queer folk from Russia and Ukraine and other countries are being persecuted well and seeking asylum. And how they're going through is different than what LGBTQ folk from Central America, Asia, and other countries are going through. And I wanted to see if you could just speak to that again to really kind of put another angle on what this problem is at the border.
So these policies, like any policy that I think we have in the United States, are not colorblind and are not implemented equally. And so when we talk about Title 42, for example, after the war in Ukraine, there was an immediate carve out for Ukrainians, right? So this is, Ukrainians are 100% in need and deserving of protection. But we have to acknowledge the fact that because these are white folks, they have access to asylum that Black folks from Haiti, for example, simply do not have. And I think what we see at every single step of the way is that it is people of color, it is Black people, it is brown people, it is indigenous people that are receiving the real brunt of the harshest policies. And then when we add LGBTQ plus status on top of that, not only are they bearing the brunt of the policies, but the consequences can sometimes be so much more severe.
Yeah.
And so, like, if we talk about there are a handful of people that are almost like the lucky ones in some ways, and that they're not expelled under these programs, and that they are then allowed into the country in order to, access asylum. And what that oftentimes means is that they're then brought into the U.S. to sit in detention centers. And the U.S. has a sprawling system of immigration detention centers that the vast majority of them are privately owned, and people are locked away from their communities, fighting an uphill battle on their asylum claims while in cruel conditions. And for LGBTQ plus people, And I know Almarosa is going to talk about this more. They're put into, pods that are aimed at like protecting them, but really what it is it's isolating. They're subject to remarkable amounts of abuse. They don't have the medical care that they need. And it's,
They don't have their identity. They don't have a
they have
community.
no identity. And if you think about it, it is cruel and it's identity stripping. And in the midst of that, you're supposed to like go through this complicated legal pathway to try and seek asylum. It's the cards are stacked against people, and it's not a functional system. It's a system based on cruelty.
Yeah, yeah. I want to actually get some of that input from Almarosa and Guerline next, and then talk to the writers as well as we continue. But Almarosa and Guerline, can you give us some more personal stories of what the LGBTQ folks are going through detention, where they're coming from and why, and what a day is like for them, what they have to go through in order to get through this process?
I can begin, if that's okay. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Almarosa Silva Bañuelos, they, them, theirs with the Trans Latina Coalition. I had the opportunity to actually do programming inside of the trans unit detention, or the trans unit pod at the Cibola Detention Center in New Mexico. And I was able to go in and visit twice a month. And I was doing one-on-one conversations with folks, but I also tried to do programming that allowed, if you will, some normalcy, restoration of human dignity, opportunities for someone's own agency to make decisions and choices, and also create moments for personal expression. A lot of our community, especially our trans asylum seeking community, there is a great talent of performance and singing and so forth. So I recall one of the women that we worked with, one of the trans women we worked with, the thing that kept her going was Celia Cruz, La Vida es un Carnaval. That was a song that she used to perform. And part of my work, I was able to speak with folks either on a daily basis or on a weekly basis. And Maura is who I'm speaking of. And one day, Maura called me and I surprised her with playing La Vida es un Carnaval by Celia Cruz. And I played it all the way to the end, just so she could sing, she could feel another moment of joy. But those moments were very special and rare, and had to be intentional, because the conditions inside of detention actually add another layer of trauma on top of one's own journey to get to the border and seeking asylum. And then they arrive to this country, and we ultimately put our relatives, our siblings in prison. There is no difference between a detention center and a private prison. The majority of the detention centers in New Mexico are all privately owned, and as many corners to be cut are had specifically on food, medical, and anything else. And it's also an opportunity for the private detention industrial complex to make money off of folks that are detained, to buy better quality food. If the weather changes and you arrived in the summer and you need a sweatshirt or sweatpants, you have to purchase those things. For the trans community, there was a stripping of one's identity. Folks get to present how they want in their own world, in their own community. And once our trans asylum seeking community arrived in detention, they were stripped of everything. And I want to say, including makeup. And it may seem like something we take for granted, but a lot of the trans women that I worked with, that's part of their identity. And so they were stripped down to just their uniform that they were forced to wear. And so we had to push really hard to get even hair care. And I know that that's going to be spoken about as well. But really the conditions were so detrimental on the inside that after about almost 2 years, CIVILA, the trans unit was closed in the state of New Mexico.
And then what happened to all of the trans seekers, the trans asylum seekers?
At that time, we had about 50 to 60 trans asylum seekers, and all of our siblings were transferred overnight in the dark without any notification to their attorneys. Folks that had my number desperately called me or tried to in the morning. But by the time I got a call, they had already been, and I'm going to use this term, they had already been shipped out to Aurora, Colorado, and Tacoma, Washington, in 2 different privately owned detention centers. And so we had to track all of our siblings to ensure that we found them and that they all had legal representation and were ultimately released.
And so you're able to do that. That's amazing. Good.
We did. We tracked everyone. And I tell you, the asylum community and the immigrant rights community in Tacoma is fierce. They actually are shutting down detention centers in Tacoma. And we have very strong relationships with folks in Aurora, Colorado, doing post-release work and making sure that all of our relatives and siblings have communication and some contact and legal representation.
That's great. A couple of things that you said, you just talked about really stuck out to me. One was that it is the prison industrial complex all over again, imprisoning people who have done nothing wrong and profiting off them, which is find completely reprehensible. And the other thing that is great is that the very thing that they were stripped of coming in to this process, you and your groups have been giving back to them, that sense of community and identity with makeup and song. And I think that's amazing. And, you know, I'm so glad that you and people like you are out there doing that work, because I didn't know, you know, like a lot of people don't know that this is what's happening at the border and what's happening in particular to trans folks at the border. And we'll come back to more of that in a second. I want to bring in our writers with some questions too. You all, this has been really amazing so far. Thank you so much for sharing all of that and taking time out to talk to us. So for our writers, let's kind of like just dig in for a little bit on how the above has influenced your work in your episodes of Little America and the arc on Superstore. I'm, you know, thinking of the season 4 finale that we talked about, Justin, and like where you get your stories from. How do you handle this? How do you handle in the comedy venue, you know, comedy world, such a topic?
Sure, I can go first. And truthfully, I mean, a lot of, excuse me, the stuff you guys have been talking about is, you know, the Superstore, the episode you're talking about was 4 years ago. And so some of these issues were, well, some were probably happening, but weren't as much in the news and weren't dealing with so much of this. But what is the framing of it? How we kind of make comedy of it, or how we come up with it?
Well, yeah, just what made you want to tell the story? Is there something personal from your life or something that you saw that made you want to, you know, pursue the story arc? And, you know, how did you treat it in a comedic setting with the sensitivity that, you know, and humanity it deserves?
Yeah. Well,
it's a big question. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I'll throw out some things. I mean, certainly nothing from my life. I'm, you know, boring, white, cisgender, hetero, everything, you know, no personal experiences in that world. But the art came from, we were in season 2 and we were doing an episode about the Olympics, and we had, thing with writers is we're always so intimately familiar with our own characters. So I'll name characters, and apologies if people don't know what the hell I'm talking about. I'll try to explain them. But we had our our boss, Glenn, who is this very nice, religious, somewhat conservative guy who, but sweet. And the Olympics made him very sort of jingoistic, pro-America. And we had our character Mateo, who's Filipino, he's supporting the Philippines, but it's about, can you support another country but still be American? And in that episode, I hadn't gone into the series planning to make that character undocumented. But it felt like it was a funny, interesting bit if he would find out in that episode that he was undocumented. And we started wondering if it was possible. And we did some research and we discovered the story of, I want to say Jose Antonio Vargas from Define American. And it was just this unbelievable coincidence that here was a gay, undocumented Filipino man who, I think his story was that he discovered he was undocumented later in life, which was so interesting and great for that character. So there were two interesting things about that. One was we started this arc that we hadn't meant to engage in, and we would go to it occasionally. And I always say that, like, we never set out to do an important or a topical story. I mean, we're a network comedy. We're there to entertain, to keep people watching, get them to watch detergent, buy detergent, in the commercials. But if we can do something with representation and so forth, so much the better. And I do feel that once you do decide to take on an important issue like this, you do at least have a duty not to misrepresent it, not to mislead people about it. And so we go to it for occasional stories, and I think it was great. It added depth to the character. It gave the series places to go. When you're doing 22 episodes a season, anything that gives you a few stories is great. And the other great thing was Define American is just this unbelievable organization. And they would talk to us on the phone. They would come to the writer's room. They would organize panels of undocumented people to come in and speak to us about their lives and their challenges. And so that was great. So over time, we would do occasional stories about, now Mateo is a character who works in the store who is undocumented, and how he hides it, and what challenges he faces. When Define American came to us one year, they talked about this one kind of visa you can get if you, and I'm going to murder it, I'm sorry, this isn't exactly right, but it's like if you get beaten up in some way, or you face violence in the country. And we're like, wow, so there's a story which our character needs to find a way to get beaten up at work. Like, that's a really funny story, but also something, that's out there. So that was one we did. I'm sorry, I'm talking forever, so I'll jump to the end.
No, it's good. And also, you did not just that storyline with the visa that Amy has flagged as a U visa, I believe, but the season finale, I can't remember the exact line, but you brought like the absurdity of the rules, of the US rules, into light, which I thought was another great way to handle that. Like, it's also, we're not just talking about the people who are enduring this, but the ludicrous and draconian rules that go into play. So I thought that was really great.
Oh yeah, well, thanks. Right. And well, I mean, so from time to time, we'd say, like, have we gotten enough stories out of it? We don't want to do the same story over and over again. We also don't want to stop doing stories about it and just forget about it. And we'd always know at some point we should have it come out that he's undocumented. But then we were like, well, we're not going to lose this amazing actor. How do you stay in the country if you're here without documentation? And we did some research and we found out there's like no way. We were like, there's got to be marriage, all this stuff, and stuff that you guys all know. And I think a lot of us in the writers' room, we were like, I don't know what we do there. And I think by the time we got to the end of season 4, we figured, how much this show can't go forever. We can do this story now and find a way to keep him around long enough. And he doesn't have to have citizenship. But as we also learned from Jose's story and many others, it's not like if it's discovered that you're undocumented, you're shipped out right away. You can contest it, and it can take years. And so we decided then was the time to do the story. And then it was, the challenge, both the challenge and the excitement of telling a story like that and making it funny for a good portion of it, finding those moments like you just alluded to that are comic and absurd and having people talk about it, and then the poignancy. And I think that was an episode that we tried to, we went out on a very, very down note of him just being arrested and handcuffed and taken away in a van. And yeah, I think that's all I have.
No, but it was a good episode, and I want to continue with Amru, but I just realized that I wanted to circle back because Guerline was also going to speak after Amorosa concerning more of some personal stories of LGBTQ folks in detention, and then we'll go back to Amru after that.
Are you waiting for me for something?
No, no, Guerline is going to talk. Thanks.
No, thank you so much. And again, thank you, Justin, for sharing that, because I think we have to bring those stories and those realities, right? The raw realities to the public in order for all of us to understand there's no pathway, there's no line. There's not a system that will allow a person who is undocumented to adjust their status. So I think it is important that we continue to bring that to Hollywood, to the big screen, to the small screens, wherever we can really highlight and center those lives. Can go back to what Amarosa was talking about before, the experiences of members of the LGBTQAI community when they come to the border to ask for asylum. For example, people from Jamaica who are literally fleeing extreme violence. We had a community member who got burned with acid, who barely escaped. And when they got to the border, they were told that they did not have a strong enough case. And at the time, half of his face was completely burned. We also had another member from Togo who barely escaped, where he was holding his partner's hand, and the partner, they were taken, and the partner got shot. He barely escaped. And when he came to ask for asylum, they literally told him he did not have a strong enough case to enter the country. We also, I can share the story of a trans woman who came from Haiti, and she was moved, as Alma mentioned, to many different detention centers, prison across the country, because they said they could not have a space that was suitable for her. And she ended up in Otay Mesa in California, that is literally at the US-Mexico border. And I will go visit her every other week. And one day I went, and she said, I really need to get my hair done. I feel so extremely uncomfortable. As Alma mentioned, my identity is being stripped away from me. They put me in a pod with men, right? And the men, even the other migrants, were making fun of her because she's obviously a woman, but because her ID was never changed to reflect her identity, she was put in a pod with men. And one time I went to visit her, she had all kind of nice, beautiful colors in her hair. And I said, so what happened? She said, I was able to use the wrapping from the ramen soup. So in those detention centers, in those prisons, the legacy that they are able to have is the 25 cents ramen noodle that we buy at the store. They buy them for $1 in those detention centers. And she used the wrapping to create ornaments for her hair. And then I looked at her, I said, you look way better than I do. I need for you to come out and do my hair to show me you how people are able to not only survive in those extremely painful conditions, but find ways to find happiness, find ways to make sure they get to the next day, and really wanted to share those stories, not just of the pain, but also the resilience of the people. So we were able to get her released on a $10,000 bond. So
wow.
After she literally walked from Jamaica, made her way to Brazil, and she walked from Brazil, took her 5 months walking from Brazil to come to the US-Mexico border. And she went to the Darien Gap, one of the most dangerous places on earth. And she barely survived, only to be put in prison in the United States for coming and asking for protection. So we created the Black Immigrants Bail Fund to be able to pay a ransom to the government to get her released. And when she got released, she did my hair.
And it is a ransom, you know, like that's what it is. It is a ransom. And your story really parallels Amorosa's story as well, about the dangers and the stripping away, as well as the finding the moments of beauty and identity that these folks go through when they're in detention. And I'm really glad that you shared that.
I want to jump in super quick. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Roxana Hernandez.
Yes.
Roxana is an example of the homophobia and transphobia and the racism within the immigration system. When Roxana entered what a lot of our asylum seekers and refugees call our hieleras, which are holding cells that are freezing, all metal, and they're given just the silver little blankets. And Roxana's health was compromised. Roxana was also HIV positive, and ICE bounced her around the country and kept her in hieleras all the way until she made it to New Mexico. She was so sick by the time she arrived, and she kept asking for medication and to be seen by a doctor. By the time she arrived to New Mexico, she was so sick she couldn't even be admitted into the Cibola Detention Center. They took her to the hospital immediately, and she died within 48 hours of arriving. So I just want to uplift Roxana Hernandez's name. She's not the only trans sibling and trans woman that died in ICE custody. Joanna Medina also died in ICE custody. But I want to uplift those names because that is the critical nature of ICE and CBP and what they do to our communities, and how they look at trans and LGBTQ asylum seekers. So I just wanted to uplift her name.
I'm glad you did. And that's, go ahead.
Thank you, Alma, for representing, and we say presenting to them. And also wanted to add the fact that our community members are not allowed nor given access to hormones. Those who are still in transition, those who really need hormones therapy to get them to where they need to be. I want to highlight that they do not have access to that, as well as they are being forced into communities that they do not belong in.
Yeah. Why would the government give them access to that when they barely give them access to any other kind of, healthcare, food, security, what, everything. Wow. Thank you, both of you, for sharing, the experience on the ground. And we will circle back to some more of that later. And right now, I wanted to just get back to the storytelling side of it with Amru, because your episode of Little America was my favorite. I really loved it. I would love to have you tell us more about it, like whatever global events. I know that you use legal documents and depositions that it's based on, how you came to it, what connection you may have felt, if any, to it. but it's a really great piece. It feels very specific and personal and universal. And it had really great moments of, yes, all this bad stuff, but also the beauty, you know?
Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who shared. I mean, I can talk about the episode. I mean, it was, but in terms of kind of the immigration, we were actually kind of embroiled within quite a lot of immigration politics, because we made that episode during the Trump era, and the actors that we wanted for one of the parts who lived in the UK had been to Libya in the past 6 years. So actually the production got cancelled because the actors were not allowed in under the Muslim ban. So we actually really felt, and again, during the premiere, a lot of the actors weren't allowed in because even, you know, and they had British passports and stuff. So we had to actually move the whole production to Canada, which was very, very expensive and really stressful. But yeah, so we were, you know, it was kind of bizarre making an episode about immigration and then, you know, immigration stopping the episode being filmed. So, you know, we really felt the Muslim ban during, and actually that is still hanging. Like, I know a lot of actors who, and just fellow creatives. I mean, I'm just lucky that, because I just haven't been to the Middle East in about 8 years for personal safety reasons. But if I had been to visit family, I don't think I would be able to be living in LA right now, because I think the Muslim ban is still kind of hanging. I'm not 100% sure, but I know it is for a lot of my friends. But yeah, the episode was Epic Magazine got 8 separate immigrants who live in America to write an essay about, you know, why they'd come or what they were doing here. And then there was an episode about a queer Syrian man who lived in Boise, Idaho, and about he had lived in Syria and then was waiting to claim asylum while he was in Iraq, and then eventually moved to the US. And he, his dad burned him really badly, and because of his sexuality, and so he needed to leave for safety. And so we had about 800 words or so to base an episode, and then reams and reams of an interview with him from the producers, so a lot of transcripts. So I mean, as a kind of writer, and me and my co-writer Stephen, I mean, we really wanted, we were allowed to invent, but we really just obviously realized how, you know, there was a real person, obviously, whose story we were really meaning to kind of excavate. And I think my biggest anxiety when I first got the gig, you know, it was Apple, it was American, it was, and the whole show was about immigrants in America. And there was, you know, we kind of touched on it right at the beginning of the session, maybe. Was that in the pre-session?
I think it was a pre-session, but yeah.
I was slightly nervous about, like, is this going to be a sort of America is the promised land for all brown immigrants, you know, a kind of white savior narrative. And so I was actually quite reluctant when I first got the gig. I just thought, oh God, what is the narrative going to be? But actually Apple were really amazing and let us just, what I was really pleased about, really pushed for in the episode was to make him fleeing his homeland, you know, a really devastating thing. I mean, his family's there. Arab culture has so much to it that, you know, American culture doesn't. You know, we wanted to show in the episode, like, the respect for the elderly that happens, like, in Arab communities. I mean, like, my parents and grandparents, when we still laugh, when we just think, oh my God, the West is so barbaric, and when they, the way they treat the elderly, like, our grandparents are literally like on thrones, basically. And so, like, we wanted to spend as much of the episode as possible not focusing too much on the I need to be in America because America is the promised land, but to actually dig around into what was so wonderful about his life in Syria and then Iraq, just so that, you know, the audience didn't come away with thinking, oh, America is so kind to let him in, but more how sad it was that he had to leave somewhere that he loved, as well as, you know, how important it was for him to come to safety because his life was at risk. And so the whole villain or victim complexity was also really on our mind as we were writing it, because again, there was like an anxiety of my anxiety, I think, of, you know, obviously it's so Islamophobic at the moment, of the audience thinking, wow, gosh, it's also barbaric in the Middle East, thank God for America. But so, and obviously his father is a really abusive man. And I suppose one of the things that we wrestled with the network, and they let us do it in the end, was actually really humanizing the father character and explaining why he's come to his decision. And Shad, and the guy whose episode it was about, really appreciated that as well, because he said, you know, my dad is not an evil man, and it was all much more societal. And so yeah, I guess as the writer of that, I just was really nervous about, not nervous, but just so cognizant about like the audience and the platform. And so I really wanted to celebrate our culture as much as possible. And he, you know, he really was very happy with the episode. And what I love about the episode is that, you know, America is necessary for his safety, but there's so much about his community that's really wonderful. And as is true to what happened to him in real life, the reason he finds safety in America is because he makes best friends with another queer Arab asylum seeker. And that's all from real testimony. And they kind of come to America together, and they kind of have like a queer chosen Arabic family. Because, you know, the guy's coming to Boise, Idaho just before Trump's America. And I don't think it's going to be like a promised land.
Yeah. Well, so, sorry, I was to say, it's interesting that you brought that up, because we did mention it in the pre-call a little bit. And so we must bring it up and talk about it more now that, you know, there are people who are coming here, and this is for, you know, all of you to chime in on, obviously. And it does give the sensation, the presentation, that it's the America Jesus Savior complex. But I'm wondering to what degree it's an object lesson for where America is headed, and something for us to be really cognizant of, because things here aren't so great for LGBTQ people right now, and they continue to erode seemingly. And whoever has thoughts on that or would like to chime in on that, I would certainly love to hear your thoughts.
One thing on that is, I did realize writing the episode that he would not most likely be granted asylum in America under current conditions, because it was quite a while ago that this all happened, and things were more liberal, and he had a fairly, in the grand scheme of things, easy, you know, it took a while, but it wasn't as dehumanizing, especially since the Muslim ban. So and knowing him and what he's found in America, and he has a partner here, and he has a life here, and he's, you know, no longer in danger, it does make me feel really heartbroken that under current conditions, someone like him wouldn't probably be able to come across. And, you know, that really is really sad for me.
Yeah, definitely. Anyone, I don't know if anyone else is going to chime in, but you don't have to. But if you do, please do. All right, well, let's talk more about storytelling, and I'll start off with Amy and Ty, and then this can be, you know, everyone can jump on this, because I know that this is Amy and Ty work from this point of view, is how can we further use the power of storytelling and characters to affect culture and affect how communities are viewed in this country? If you have some examples of like great stuff you've seen and some stuff that's not so great, anything like that to get the conversation started would be awesome.
Well, if you'll let me jump in real quick and just go back to your last question about what's going on in the US, I'm happy to add a couple of things there, because I do think it's a really poignant or important point that we're going through a really rough patch in the United States, especially at the state level right now for LGBTQ people, where we have states, many states across the country, where legislation is moving that bans speech in corporations, bans speech in schools, penalizes teachers, penalizes parents and medical providers of trans youth. And kind of our community is being used as a a tool as part of a culture war and a ever-growing politically divided moment between states that on LGBTQ issues are going backwards, and those that are out there as models when it comes to LGBTQ policy. And so there's very much two different worlds for LGBTQ people, possibly depending on where you live at the moment. If you're a trans person or a parent of a trans youth in Florida or Alabama or Texas, you're hearing messages that what you're doing to support your child is akin to child abuse. If you're a teacher in a same-sex relationship in Florida and you talk about your spouse or your significant other, does that mean your job's in jeopardy? And so we're going through this awful moment where some politicians think that it's politically advantageous for them to target those that are perhaps at times most vulnerable, especially youth, for political points. And while that's working now, I really hope we're looking at a day where this is a real bump in the road that we have to get back, but it's a devastating moment for LGBTQ folks and especially LGBTQ youth in this country. And so there is no panacea here by any means in being part of this community, and the things we hear about ourselves, about our community, the term of being considered a groomer at this moment, which is some of the lexicon we're hearing from those that oppose our rights. It's definitely not a perfect environment by any means, and really dependent on where in the country you might live.
Yeah, definitely. So I feel like the one thing that we can all do is write about that and find stories to tell about all that, to illustrate what people are going through, to affect culture and affect change. And if there are any things that you all would like to start the conversation off with, you and Amy, then by all means jump in.
I wanted to add one thing.
Yeah.
For example, when we are looking into communities that our siblings are coming into, for example, somebody from Jamaica, from Togo, from Nigeria, from Haiti, that are being criminalized back home, right? And they barely escape. But when they come into the United States, for normally asylum seekers would go to a sponsor who is a family member, community member. But for LGBTQ members, we are seeing that they cannot go to their family members because the same prejudice that is back home is also within those communities here, right? Just because they leave, that doesn't mean those biases and anti-Black prejudices and all of those are still a part of the community. So for us, we are still trying to find safe space outside of the communities that would have normally be receiving asylum seekers. For example, I had a brother from Senegal, and then he stayed with me for 2 weeks because he was afraid to go to his sister and tell his sister what had happened and tell them that he is gay, right? So it's not just that they fled, they made the journey here, but they still don't have a community to welcome them.
Right, because it's the same people with the same the prejudices that they're leaving as their same family over here. It's very similar to how they're escaping the religious persecution, but the religious groups are handling the transfer of them, and you don't get a break at all. Guerline, what other types of stereotypes or myths would you like to dispel about the population you represent at Haitian Bridge Alliance, especially as it relates to Black LGBTQ asylum seekers?
The over criminalization of our community members is one of the things we see, and also understand that the immigration prison system was built for Haitians who were presumed gay and had and presumed having AIDS, HIV/AIDS in the 1970s, 1980s. I don't know if you remember that when they were having a hard time understanding what AIDS was, they named it the 4-H's, right? And two of the 4-H that was part of who actually carried HIV and AIDS were Haitians and Haitians and homosexuals, right? So these were the 2H that the government used to explain. So therefore they said, well, if you're Haitian, therefore you're homosexual, that's why you had AIDS, so you need to be imprisoned. And they literally created a system that we see being used now to imprison all people. So that's another myth that we still continuing still today, 30, 40 years later, trying to take away from our community. The Haitian American community was completely dismantled due to that stereotype, right?
Yeah.
So just to give you an idea of how rooted into anti-Black racism, into homophobic ideologies that the entire system is, and therefore there is no safe space, even in the United States, when they come to ask for support for asylum. And it is painful, right, to tell people, welcome here, but at the same time, you have to be extremely careful.
Yeah.
Rosa?
I would say thank you so much. That I just want to also uplift the resiliency of our community. As we get attacked from stateside, different communities, including family members, something that really has developed over the years are trans-led asylum homes. So there is a network across this country that have opened up trans asylum homes, and they're led by trans folks. And so these homes really have become that community that didn't necessarily exist prior to that. Because I will agree with one of our panelists saying that the community aspect is so critical for someone's emotional well-being, and to continue to survive and thrive in this country. Not having citizenship, residency, it's hard enough to get a job and to work in this country, especially during COVID. And as an asylum seeker, as a trans LGBTQ asylum seeker that may not have a work permit authorization, really is critically dependent on the community. ICE and CBP, once folks are released, don't care. In fact, I feel like they allow folks to, or they push the cases so far out that they expect somebody to get in some kind of trouble, in some kind of situation to where they actually are deportable. And so that's part of the immigration system, I feel, and I see it. Especially during COVID, we saw cases pushed out 2 to 3 years out. How do folks survive without being able to work with documents, right? And so it forces folks to alternative economies and to work without documents for survival. But right now, a lot of the trans community specifically has created pockets to where folks are supported. So with trans,
they can thrive.
And thrive, because it's not just you get here and thrive. It's get here, survive, figure it out. Language, streets, kitchens, hot water handles, cold water handles. How do you flush the toilet? How do you turn on the stove? These things that we may take for granted in Western culture are things that are very different for our siblings that come over. So one, there's that compassion to share, to teach, but also the community that comes together to hold our siblings. Because it's the trans community that knows where that hormone replacement therapy is, knows which clinics are actually free, and working together for housing and food. So as much as we are getting attacked, we are building a resistance against that, but also not letting our trans asylum seekers or LGBTQ siblings fall through the cracks.
Yeah, that's great. That's empowering, and I love that. We have about 20 minutes left, and we're opening up to Q&A, folks. So if anyone has Q&A, please drop it into the Q&A portion, and we'll either answer it online or while we're talking. Someone had asked, how do we tap into the universal humor that opens hearts and minds while tackling hard topics, which was going to be my next question, really, was let's discuss how to use empathy over sympathy and avoiding tropes of villain and victim, showing common shared humanity, multifaceted characters, as opposed to the cliche default of focusing on the trauma, right? We want to see these folks going through this as more than just their gender identities, right? And this is certainly open to all panelists. I'd love to hear from the writers, how they view approaching characters in this situation, as well as from those of you who are boots on the ground.
I don't really have a great answer, but no one's talking, so I'll just start talking to make noise. I don't know. No, I mean, look, it's hard. I think we can continue trying to represent different groups, and when you go right at some of these topics with the objectives of, let me look at, opening hearts and minds. That's still an objective. And I always find it very challenging to get comedy when you have an objective in mind. I mean, you can be funny, but in the end, the people that will like that show, that joke, are the people that already support you. If you have an objective in mind, the people that aren't on board for that are just going to feel preached at, and also they're not going to laugh. So you're going to have failed on both counts. So I think if that is sort of the objective there, maybe it's about approaching it a little more obliquely, trying to tell stories, chip away at the edges, as we did. Like, we could make jokes about the how difficult it is to immigrate here, and sort of some of the contradictions, but I think, not to toot our own horn, but I think you could have watched that episode of Superstore, and at least I hope, even if you were fairly right wing, even if you were like, well, you know what, people like Mateo shouldn't be in this country because they didn't come about the right way, and so forth, that you could still get into Mateo's shoes and understand where he's coming from and where the people who cared about him are coming from, and maybe at least gain some understanding. Look, no one's going to watch certainly my show and decide to vote for someone they weren't going to vote for at the beginning. But I think, all this stuff, all social progress is a marathon. And, I think things are probably, despite the challenges, better in certain ways than they were 10 years ago, and better than they were 20 years ago. And 10 years from now, they'll be better. And, the arc of history is long, but bends towards justice. I'm sure I'm murdering that quote, but I like to think it's true. I'll stop talking now and someone else can say something smart.
No, that's great. Thanks for saying that. And I'd love to hear from someone else as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually come from the UK. I mean, I only moved here this year, but the writing that there's quite a lot of trauma porn out there, on some of the mainstream, like BBC and that kind of stuff. When you tell a kind of minority story, it has to have this sort of dramatic prestige, which means, like what I call trauma porn. And it's and like, even when I think about the difficulty I had in Iraq or wherever, like, even when you're going through a really difficult time, you're not wallowing in trauma every second of every single day. You're trying to get through your day. And so, I mean, what we tried to do with our episode was really not focus too much on the reason for it, trying to escape the country, or like the admin around it, trying to justify why this person deserves a place to stay, but just what we kind of spent most of the episode in the in-between, sort of just kind of waiting, where the character's kind of waiting to see what's going to happen, and just like try to find as much humanity and joy. And they do lip syncs to Sally Fields in one part of the episode, and they just try to get on with their life. And our hope was that just showing the detail of that. I mean, I agree with Justin. I wasn't thinking that like this episode was going to get Candace Owens to like become the most liberal person in the world. I just wasn't, but I just thought, well, people think of Arabs as barbarians or victims or whatever, so if we can just put them on screen for half an hour and just have them do everyday things in what I think is a funny way. I mean, I was just writing the stuff that I do with my own friends, which that I find funny, then people can empathize with the character. Because I guess you don't think too much about like, is this going to affect legislation, but more, will someone who may potentially not know an Arab or have a preconceived idea of a Muslim just like the character, which I think does do something slowly. That's really like what, I didn't think we would reverse the Muslim ban, with the one episode, but.
Well, also what's nice about that too, your episode and episodes like yours, is that there's some little queer kid somewhere watching that, and it's like you can go through a bunch of bad crap and you can come out okay. And I think that's also important too, is for kids. There are still plenty of kids in this country and around the world who are in the closet or don't know who they're gay, don't know that they're gay, and for them to see something like this, it can really resonate with them on a level and they may not even understand it yet.
Yeah, I mean, it did really resonate. I mean, sadly, the episode was banned from Russia and every Middle Eastern country, where I was hoping that, younger versions of me in Iraq or whatever would be able to get to see it. But I do believe that there were some online networks who were, I'm not really allowed to say because I'm sure Apple have bugged my phone, but that it did get out there to the right people.
Yeah, they saw it
through the networks that Alma was talking about. Omarosa, sorry.
Yeah, definitely. No, I know that, I'm sure that they saw it. Some of those folks who needed to see it saw it. Any other ideas of takeaways to help make positive change across the issues we're discussing, either from writers or from the folks in the NGOs, about storytelling, the importance of it, and how we can continue to use it for topics such as this?
Mm-hmm. I think, no, sorry, go
ahead,
Amy.
Gerline.
I think centering the lives and realities of the people are key to bringing awareness, right? Because there's the fear, there's people really being put in a box. And sometimes there is no other outlet of expression other than taking that reality, taking that narrative and share that with somebody else. And always go back to centering the voices and experience of impacted community members, like Justin mentioned and Amo mentioned, to really, showcase these people. We are real, right? We came, we made the journey. We deserve happiness. We deserve to not just survive, but thrive. But centering the voices, the realities, I think it is key for us to get to the next step. So thank you so much for that, and also strongly believe when we share those narratives, we will start seeing a shift in the perspective of how people view members of our communities.
Yeah, I think that's the key. I think it's really great. I'm glad that you said that. Are anyone else want to chime in? I think Amy, you were going to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think I very much was going to say something along the lines of what Gerline said. And the way that I think about it a little bit is through relationships, right? That if you think about the people that you love and your friends and the people that you're in community with, you're not friends with them because of the hardest thing that they've done in their life. You're not friends with them because they've had some kind of trauma. I have a lot of friends that I think are really amazing and badass because of those things, but they're my friends because they're funny. They're my friends because they're kind. They're my friends because we get along well and we vibe well. And if you think about, I'm not a writer, I'm not in the industry, but at the end of the day, I turn on my TV and I like to relax by watching TV. And those are kind of like friends coming into my living room, right? And you build relationships with the people that you see on your screens in those same way, with like dynamic characters that maybe have really diverse experiences. And they think there's a real opportunity to show those kinds of experiences and allow people across the country to build relationships with the people that they see on the screens that have real lives that are sometimes complex. I mean, I think one of the things that I think this week has been in my head so much is that, in my day job with Amnesty, I'm doing advocacy to Congress and the administration about restoring the human right to seek asylum. And in my mornings and late evenings, I'm going to the bus station because the governor of Texas is busing people from the border and dropping them off on the side of the road in front of the bus station in DC. And one of the folks that I met, on one of the first buses is a LGBTQ asylum seeker from Venezuela. And we've just totally bonded. We went shopping together at Target. We tried and failed to get him a functioning cell phone with a SIM card. And he was like, it was a comedy of errors. He was like, Amy, why can't you fix this? You're from the US. It's not that hard to do a SIM card. And I was like, listen, technology is not my friend. And we were just laughing over a cell phone for 45 minutes. And he's been just hitting me up on WhatsApp throughout this whole thing just to say, how are you? What's going on? Make sure you take time to hang out with your friends. And his experience fleeing Venezuela, traveling through the Darien Gap, traveling through Mexico, going to the border, all of that, being bused to DC as part of this racist, xenophobic political stunt by the governor of Texas is terrible, and it makes him a brave, resilient individual. And also, he's a really cool guy. He's really sweet. And those are the stories that we need to tell more of people that are complex, that have survived a lot, but also can just be your regular friend that hits you up on WhatsApp at the end of the day just to check in how you're doing and see how you're feeling. And the fact that I found him dropped off on the side of the road half a mile from Congress. These are two different worlds, right? And I feel the way that we can get to real America, whatever that may be, is how do we tell those stories more? And how do we tell those stories in a way that's not about talking points, that's not about some scary boogeyman of national security or some scary boogeyman of, people coming across the border and America first and whatever it may be. The real change is going to come when people are I feel like I have a friend on TV that I turn into every whatever night when I'm tired at the end of the day and I feel like I could be their friend if I knew them in real life, and they're an asylum seeker. And maybe people have the privilege of having those people in their real life too. But that's how that, like, the long, the long arc towards justice, that's how we get there.
Yeah.
I would just
that
add
makes a lot of
super
sense.
quick before we move on to another topic for the writers. And it's something that we are historically having issue with in this country anyway, but integrating the trans narrative, and especially a trans asylum seeker narrative, in any plot, I think is critical, because what we heard earlier are some of the commonalities of communities or culturally not being accepted because of immigration laws, right, that are racist by nature. And then I would also just say that bringing in trans characters helps build a normalcy for our own society. And then I'll just throw this shot out. Trans characters can be acted by trans actors. I think that's important as well.
That's great. Thanks. One of the questions we got from the audience was, unless Amy Fisher, did you answer that? I can't figure out what this Q&A is saying to me, but it looks like, okay. One way to bring about change is at the ballot box, but I feel so disappointed in the Biden administration and Democratic Party's reaction on real humane immigration reform. Are there any beacons of light that might not be on our radar? Any political leaders out there that are stepping up their game on immigration? If so, how can we support them? Broad, big question. What do we do?
I'm new to US politics, so all I can say is, oh my God, what a shit show. I've just been watching it for about 6 weeks, and compared to the UK, it seems like there's pockets of the US that are way more liberal than the UK, but then the extreme bits on the right are some of the scariest bits on the right that I've ever seen. So I'm just kind of watching in horror at the moment, to be honest.
Yeah.
Answer, but it's been a rude awakening.
Yeah, I think Amy and I, go ahead, Amy, please.
I'm going to be very quick, Arlene, because I think there are a handful of members of Congress that are doing well. I would say there are 0 members of Congress doing enough. And, to hear what Omarosa is saying about the, trans asylum seekers and the work that Gerline is doing and the stories that Gerline is telling about, Black LGBTQ asylum seekers, and there is so much work to be done. And so instead of saying who are the ones that are, owning it, there are some that are doing good work. None of them are doing enough. And so I think the answer is you need to be calling your member of Congress and saying, what are you doing to protect LGBTQ asylum seekers? What is your solution? What are you doing? Where is your leadership? Because it's not enough.
Yeah, that's a really great point. It's not enough.
And I would just add, one of the messages to Congress is ending trans detention. It's ending detention for LGBTQ folks as well, but ending trans detention specifically because of the additional harms and trauma that happen inside detention. The system is not set up for transgender people. It's a binary system, and they only know how to function in a gender binary, which is detrimental and dangerous to trans folks.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think there's some really great ideas about how I think a lot of what you're saying, if I may interpret from a couple of you, is that stay involved, stay aware of what's going on, and be involved in your community, which is the local, the state, and the federal level communities. Yeah, I think that's really important. All right, unless, I'm sorry, was someone going to say, add something else?
I will just add this, and I apologize for taking up space. But it took moving our own communities, elected officials in our own states, and over 50 members of Congress to get Kelly released from detention. And Kelly is a trans woman from Honduras that was detained for 3 years. 3 years over 3 to 4 detention centers. She has now since been released, but it took moving Congress to get her out of detention. So those single calls actually do make an impact. So anything folks can do, it really does make an impact.
That's great. Call your rep, everyone. All right, we are just a few minutes left, so we should get wrapping up. I want to thank all of you for attending tonight. Thanks for taking the time out of your personal time at the end of the day when you used to decompress from the day to be here and talk about the stuff that you work so hard on, all the work that you do, and the writers. I know that you are probably have deadlines and things to write. So thanks so much for coming out tonight. Really appreciate that. And thank you everyone who came, and hopefully this will be up on the website for the future. Thank you everyone. Have a good night.